couple times a year, he calls me to thank me for saving his life. And invite me to his dad's hunting cabin. He's like, come up hunting with us. And I'll tell you, of any of the criminal investigations that I've ever done, and we've been pretty successful. I mean, we've been pretty successful on most of the criminal investigations we've done. Nothing gives me as much satisfaction as that kid. The fact that I was able to help him out of a situation that he thought was dire, that he had nowhere to turn. The fact that he was able to do that and now be in a place that he's at now, nothing, and probably nothing ever will top that for me as an adult.
Okay, can you introduce yourself for me, please?
Yeah, Ron Shackle.
And Ron, can you tell me a little bit about growing up and ultimately what led you to law enforcement?
Grew up in the suburbs north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Normal kind of suburban kind of upbringing. More or less kind of a blue collar maybe upper middle class, maybe middle class. Dad worked, he was a cabinet maker by trade, but ended up working for Minnesota Department of Corrections. Started as a foreman, running a cabinet shop. And they made all the cabinets for all state offices, like college, St. Cloud State University, where I ended up graduating from many years later. But all of the cabinets that would go into that state university came out of his shop. Ultimately, he was able to build the correctional industry into what they now call MinCorp, and retired as the director from there. He's a pretty strict guy, but not in a corporal punishment kind of way, more in a very... he demanded that I accept responsibility. He demanded that and he would give me things to be responsible for, when I was growing up. Mom was there as essentially a different era. She supported Dad, but she was also a career woman. She was an RN. She was a nurse, worked at St. Paul Children's Hospital. She ended up being a head nurse, and then ended up being the state epidemiologist nurse. She and the state epidemiology doctor, they basically, set policy for hospitals around the state. So,
did you have any brothers and sisters?
I still have a sister from my mom and dad. I have had a half brother and a half sister from my dad's first marriage prior to him meeting my mom. So,
any of them go into law enforcement at all?
Not unless you include getting arrested. No.
High school, school-wise.
Yeah.
How were you? Are we a good student, bad student?
In high school, at least when I was growing up, everything's broken up into cliques. You got the burnouts, the geeks, the whatever, the jocks. They had, I was a 3-sport athlete, and I pulled a B average without trying really hard. I mean, I tried, but not like really hard. And I probably could have gotten A's if I'd applied myself, but I was more interested in playing sports. So yeah, I got good grades, but not great grades.
Was there anything that happened during high school that basically led you to law enforcement?
I've thought on this, and I just don't think that there was any one thing. Dad kind of ran the house in a very not a militaristic way, although he had been in the military when he was younger. He was in the Navy. Just the way that I was expected to be responsible. I was expected to be not only for my own actions, but my sister, who is still with us. She was younger than me. We had dogs. Both my parents worked. There was things that I was responsible for. Like I said, not just myself. And so, for whatever reason, my upbringing is probably what led me to it. But there's not one thing that I can say defined it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know why I ended up in law enforcement. I can tell you that in ninth grade, I remember writing a term paper. We were required to write a term paper based on what we thought we wanted to do as a career. You had to pick 3 career fields. I picked an attorney, a fighter pilot, or an FBI agent. We all know that I didn't become an FBI agent. Thank God for that. But a brother or sister agency, depending on how you're referring to it. But during that, I was also required to conduct interviews. I interviewed an attorney who happened to be a friend of the family. I interviewed this is in ninth grade. I interviewed a fighter pilot who, through a friend of a friend, I was able to kind of meet with. And I interviewed a police officer because in ninth grade, you don't really know the difference between, it's law enforcement, So I'm glad I didn't get led down the FBI road, though. I might say that a couple times during this interview. So.
In 1998, you joined the Navy. How old are you?
1988.
1988. Yeah, 88.
I'm 54, coming up on 55. And graduated from high school in 87. Actually had a job from the time I was 16, though. I worked at Burger King. I got a scholarship, though. Burger King actually gave me a scholarship, a $1,000 scholarship. And back in 87, $1,000, I mean, that paid for 1 year of school. I went to college for a year, realized that, and I knew I was going to pay out of my own pocket. My parents told me from the start, your sister's going to graduate the year that we retire. We're not paying for her college. We're not paying for yours. So I knew that I was going to have to pay. And so I used the scholarship. I paid to go to college for a year, realized that I probably needed to do something else and come back to college. And that's when I went in the military. I went in the Navy in 1988.
So we talked a little bit about this before we started the interview, but ultimately part of the reasons why you went into the Navy was to build your resume.
Yeah.
I find that pretty mature, pretty unique. I mean, so explain that process to me where, hey, I'm going to go into the Navy with this being the goal of ultimately hoping getting into a federal agency.
Yeah. And ironically, or maybe ironically is not the right word, but when I went to speak to the recruiter, I did it on my own. I was 18. My parents didn't go with me. And I knew that I wanted to end up in law enforcement. I knew I wanted to be a federal agent at that time. And I knew that a top secret security clearance, having that in my back pocket, so to speak, would do wonders for me in the future. And so when I went to talk to the recruiter, I talked about different job fields, ratings is what they call in the Navy. And he suggested a CT rating, a crypto. And so that's what I ended up doing. And I, like I said, I knew that I was going to need that. My military experience, a security clearance, a college degree, and at 18, I knew that I was going to have to start checking boxes. I knew I wasn't going to get the job at 19 or 20. It might not be till my mid or late 20s that I get the job that I want. Unfortunately, I think we've lost that. That you have a lot of teenagers or young adults who think that they can walk in and go, well, I could do your job. I want your job. And that's just not how things work. So anyway.
Was there anything that the Navy taught you that helped you out later on in your law enforcement career?
Yeah, I was able to, when I got out, I was what they call a tech control supervisor. I ensured that satellite uplinks were working with our communications gear, and our crypto gear was working, and we could communicate with fleet resources. We worked with agencies, the agency, so to speak, as well as NSA. And we were able to do, we were able to be that funnel for communications between the field assets and the people that needed to know, so to speak. But in doing that, attention to detail was probably the biggest thing that came out of my military career. Well, I don't know if you call 4 years with the Navy a career. I did go on into the Army Guard, but it's not a career per se. But during my time with the Navy, being responsible, again, kind of goes back to responsibility, and that attention to detail is really what probably came out of that most.
During the time that you were with the Navy, you end up doing an internship with ATF. How does that come about?
Yeah, so I had there's a guy, he's probably retired now because he was certainly older than me, named Russ Trauig. He was a Secret Service agent at the time, but he came and spoke at one of my sociology or government classes, whatever, when I was at St. Cloud State. Spoke to him after class. I was able to kind of keep in touch with him. And after my junior year, I was looking for internships, knowing that I wanted to go into federal law enforcement. So I was searching for available internships. And I found one with U.S. Marshals. But I called Russ and asked him, I say, hey, I got an internship with U.S. Marshals. And he says, you're probably going to be doing mostly courtroom security type stuff. He says, it's not going to be very exciting. You're probably not going to enjoy it. He said, but he said, if I was you, I would encourage you to maybe look towards something like ATF. He knew where I came from. He knew what kind of my goals were. He knew I'd been in the military. I wasn't a traditional college student. I was 24 or so when I met him. And so, a lot of college students, 18, 19, 20. And so he knew where I was headed, and he suggested ATF. And so I actually inquired, and they happened to have one available in St. Paul. That's kind of what led me to it. And when I interviewed and got it, I was happy. And during the course of the internship, I was happy that I had that experience. I experienced a major arson fire that I got to work. I mean, as an intern, I'm digging out an arson scene. Now, today, I think arson is kind of snooze-worthy. I mean, it's not super exciting to me. It's not something I love doing, but it is one of the things that fall under ATF jurisdiction. And it was of a church. So, I mean, that was super interesting. Back in the day, I was able to go out on undercover buys. And I had to be in the wire car, but I could listen to the wire. I was with one or two other agents in the wire car, and that's not allowed anymore. You can't do that anymore. But for me, it was super exciting, and I was like, this is what I want to do. So as soon as I graduated from college, I started making applications, and I applied. I actually applied with DEA. And went through their hiring process. ATF was frozen at the time. and I know you know what frozen, hiring freeze in government means. Ultimately, I landed a job with a police department, Sioux Falls Police Department, and one of the guys that was in my office in St. Paul while I was doing an internship, Jim Olson, had transferred from St. Paul to Sioux Falls, and he knew I was a police officer there, and he reached out to me and said, hey, there's a closed opening, meaning it was open to government employees or people who were vets. And that's how I applied with ATF and got hired with ATF, is through that, the VRA, the Veterans Readjustment Appointment Act. So
before we start talking about Sioux Falls, there's basically, I don't want to say incident, but basically you go through a period here where you meet a woman, you're 21, then ultimately you get married when you're 23, and this woman has a 4-year-old child.
Yeah.
Same kind of question that I had for you about the resume, right? You're like 18 years old. You realize you have to figure out this resume because you have a goal later on. At 21, you meet this woman. She's got a 4-year-old, and then you decide to marry her.
Yeah.
It seems to me a very mature, for lack of a better term, decision that you make. Where is this maturity coming from, getting married at that age with a 4-year-old and the whole resume thing?
Again, that I think that comes from parenting. I couldn't have asked for better parents. I know some people are led into the jobs or career fields or even bad decisions, prison, jail, whatever, through either the lack of parenting or crappy parenting that they might have. I couldn't have asked for better parents. Great role models, both worked hard, both demanded responsibility and accountability. And that's kind of where all that came from. And I was, but ironically, I mentioned responsibility and accountability. When I met Tricia, my ex-wife, I was out with friends in a college town away from base because we didn't want to be around any military people. So we're in a college town getting drunk. So that's when I met her. We ended up communicating and going on some dates, and she introduced me to Carrie, who was 4 at the time, and ultimately ended up raising Carrie as my own daughter, and was happy to do so. And she's more or less well adjusted now, and we can get into the estrangement type stuff later. But
right.
Yeah.
So 97, you start with Sioux Falls PD. How was that experience in terms of helping you become a good ATF agent later on?
Well, out of the gate, I was pretty naive. I didn't live a life as a young child, as a teenager, or even when I was in my early adulthood. I didn't live a life that included things like, there are people that experiment with marijuana, that kind of stuff. I never did. To this day, have never done any illicit drugs of any kind. I don't even smoke. I don't drink coffee. I do like whiskey. So because I didn't come from that world, so to speak, I didn't know criminals. I didn't know those. I didn't really have any of that experience when I was coming up during my formative years. It took a minute for me to kind of get into the swing of things as a police officer. I had some good field training officers, and I can remember one time when I was first phase, I think. I'd gotten through the police academy. Police academy was easy because it's academics and athletics and shooting. That part's easy. It's the getting involved and communicating with somebody on the street, trying to figure out what they're doing, why they're doing it, why the reporting party called to report them being a whatever they're doing, right? A disorderly suspect or disorderly conduct type of thing. And Lance, one of my FTOs, first phase, he was curious to see how I would react. And we go to a disorderly subject call in the parking lot of a gas station, who's milling around the pumps and is generally harassing customers as they come in, panhandling, trying to just generally harassing customers. And we pull up and I start talking to him, and I'm so green. I don't know what I'm doing really. I'm like, what are you doing? And Lance, who was wanting to test me, he wanted to see how I would react. He probably in his back of his mind knew this guy was going to jail for doing the stuff that had already been reported by the reporting party, but he wants to see how I'm going to react to it. So he essentially pimps this guy into getting spun up. Now I've got to wrestle him to the ground, and he's doing it just to see how I'm going to react to it. And so that was kind of one of my first eye-openers to being a police officer. Ultimately, I found it almost more of a challenge than wrestling with somebody, which I enjoyed. Don't get me wrong. I loved getting into a fight if I needed to. But I found it more challenging to see if I could talk somebody into handcuffs and into the back of the car. If I knew that they had to be arrested, it was such a satisfying feeling that they chose to get into the car with handcuffs on. And then when I dropped them off at booking, I'd go to leave and they would say, "Thanks, Officer Shackle. We'll see you later." That to me, because I knew that the next time I dealt with them on the street, I was probably going to have even if I had to take them to jail again, I was going to have a positive reaction. I was going to have a positive interaction. That's kind of always been the way I've gone about doing my job.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we discussed again prior, which is you kind of have this motto of your whole career is about building relationships more than anything.
And today, and not just career, but even today, when I'm teaching overseas now, and we can get into that at the end if you want. Every contact that I have with somebody, I look at it as an opportunity to build a relationship. That doesn't mean it's going to be a lifelong relationship. It might only last 30 minutes, but it's a relationship nonetheless. And if you can find yourself, or I find that if I can find myself in that kind of sphere, I feel like things go better. It's always going to go better. Instead of trying to be that fish that swims upstream, or I'm trying to fight the man and I'm trying to just push against the current type of thing. I think if you go through life doing that, you're just unhappy all the time. And that's not what I want to do. I want to try to be a happy guy,
Eventually, in 2001, you transitioned to become an ATF agent. Why not just stay a officer at Sioux Falls?
It was a hard decision. I had a lot of fun on patrol. I had some great friends that I still communicate with today. And as a matter of fact, I was in Sioux Falls in July and had dinner with a couple of them. And I knew it's weird. It's weird because you talk about knowing that I wanted to build a resume, knowing that, I always am thinking ahead. Always. There's always an end game with me. I'm always, once I get to this goal, I'm setting my sights on the next goal, and I'm constantly doing that. And I kind of felt like if I stayed as a police officer, I would probably stagnate. The other thing that I saw is the guy who recruited me, Jim Olson, that I've already mentioned. He mentioned to me, he was a Fargo police officer before he became an ATF agent. And one of the things he mentioned to me really resonated. And that was, he says, walk in to any police department, lineup or briefing prior to a shift, day shift. That's where all the old timers go because they don't have to deal with general criminals. They're not having to chase people and run after people and that kind of stuff. So the old timers spend time on day shift. Walk into any day shift and see what the demeanor is. And it really resonated with me because I paid attention to that afterwards, after he told me that. And they were all miserable. All of them. They're in their late 50s, looking to, they're just biding their time to retire. And they do it every day, sitting in a car, mostly sedentary. Sure, they got to answer calls on occasion, but day shift doesn't. Day shift is the slowest shift. That's why they're there. And I was like, I can't see myself being one of these guys. I can't do this. And that's what helped me make the decision. And I knew that there'd be other challenges. I'd get to travel around at least this nation, if not travel around the world to some extent, and do a fun job, have possibilities of doing outside extracurricular type duties, and I just knew that it would be more fulfilling. It was going to fill my cup, so to speak, more than staying a police officer, and it did.
2001, you become an ATF agent. Explain to the audience what an ATF agent's responsibilities are.
Generally speaking, to enforce criminal code under Title 18, mostly having to do with firearms and arson and explosives. Also under Title 26, which is the NFA laws, which are going to be your machine guns, silencers, that kind of suppressors, those types of things, explosives. And that's it in kind of legal terms. But from a realistic standpoint, it really boiled down to gangs, guns, and drugs. That's what it was for me. Violent crime. That's almost all I ever did. I worked with Boise PD as an informal task force officer. Actually, had an office in their office for over 11 years, and I worked their shift. I worked their cases, and in turn, they worked mine. And it was because we were basically scratching each other's back, so to speak. I'd go out and help them on a little dope deal that would turn into something bigger, which ended up with a guy who was dealing either quarter pounds or half pounds or pounds, who was doing it armed or had other guys working for him who were armed. Well, now I'm involved. I'm already there from the ground floor. And I would work informants with them. And so, yeah, that's generally speaking what ATF does from a field perspective. And I know that we're going to get into political ramifications later, and we'll talk about that when you get there.
Can you talk about the difference that you saw, or the difference in gratification? Maybe gratification is not the right word, but the difference between being a police officer versus a federal agent.
Yeah, so the police, as a first responder, when I'll give you an incident that I actually, I don't want to toot my own horn or anything, but I ended up getting a chief's commendation for, and that was out of the gate, we get dispatched, myself, Tim Bakke, and Troy Lubke. I'm surprised I still remember their names. It was 24 years ago. We get dispatched out of the gate to a essentially protection order violation. A woman's on the phone saying her ex-husband is present in her front yard. While en route, not running code, we're just headed down there. While en route, it escalates. And the ex-husband throws a big stone, landscaping stone, through the front plate glass window. She's on the phone with him, with 911. And now we're picking it up. And we get there. And when we get there, he had barricaded the rear door. We didn't know where they were in the house. Troy and Tim run to the front door. I run to the back door. Back door's barricaded with big landscaping stones, so she can't get out. I immediately know that that's probably not the location that I need to be, and I run around to the front to help with Troy and Tim. And when I come in, Troy and Tim have him at gunpoint. He is dragging her backwards up the stairs. I immediately pull my gun, but realize that it's a very tight area. And 3 guns in that little stairwell is not a good idea. So I reholster and I grab a hold of his pant leg because he's kind of on his butt pushing himself and dragging her up the stairs. I grab a hold of his pant leg. His hand keeps going inside of his coat. And I can hear Tim, and the audio is played in the jury trial that came later, where Tim is yelling at him, "If you pull a fucking knife, I'm going to shoot you dead. If you pull a knife, I'm going to shoot you dead." And his hand keeps going inside of his coat, At one point, his hand comes out, and it's free, and I can see both hands, because one hand's around her, and the other one's here. And I start pulling as hard as I can on his leg, and I pull him, and he comes down the steps, and she ends up upside down, going head down the steps. What had happened is he had a belt, and he had tied himself to her. And so he's getting drug, and she's getting drugged, but now she's coming down like this. And ultimately, we separate the two of them. He's fighting with us. We take him out the front door onto the front. It's like a 80-year-old house, great big stoop, patio, porch out front. We take him down to the ground, and we wrestle him to get cuffs on. He's fighting us in a pile of glass that was caused by the rock that he threw there. And we find out after things subdue a little bit, is that he's got a kit. He's got a duffel bag that he brought with him, with 2 rolls of duct tape, a bottle of vodka, a change of clothes, a couple of garbage bags, a scissors, and a knife. But he's also wearing 2 pairs of pants. He's got 1 pair of jeans on and another pair of jeans on over the top of that. We surmise because he thought that he was either going to need to shed clothes or he might get blood on his clothes. He was there to kill her. And so a long way to answer your question was the fact that we saved her in that moment as first responders had immediate gratification. You realize that you just saved a woman's life from being murdered. And then we went back to work and continued doing it, right? I mean, but that immediate gratification was far different than working with ATF. ATF is an investigative job for the most part. You have phases that you move into tactics and that kind of stuff where you start hitting houses and doing the fun stuff. But most of it's investigations. And that might take, and I know you've done this over the course of, we're not talking weeks, we're talking months and sometimes years to finish an investigation. I was involved in 3 outlaw motorcycle gang investigations I was a case agent on that took multiple years on both of those, on all 3 of those. And so that delayed gratification is something you kind of got to get used to, because it's not that of a police officer. So long way to answer your question.
When you start working with Boise PD and you basically have an office over there, what kind of cases are you typically working with those guys?
We're doing mostly narcotics, a little bit of vice, and ultimately, though, I would say it's tough to put a percentage on it, but the narcotics cases that we were working, in many cases, had links to cartel. In many cases, we ended up having you or John or Russ or somebody that jumps in after we've made a few buys, maybe a couple of arrests, and we're now upwards into the pounds, on meth. Or most of the time, I mean, this area is mostly a meth area, but it wouldn't take long into the course of an investigation where we would find out that somebody that we were dealing with was carrying a gun during that deal. And my job essentially was to every suspect that we came across in a narcotics investigation, we made sure we had them identified. Their criminal history was identified. We knew who they were. We knew what their background was. And if we found that they were armed, that brought me into the fold. If somebody was dealing drugs and armed while they were dealing drugs, that immediately brought me into the fold. So generally speaking, we're doing narcotics investigations.
You had mentioned just a few minutes ago that you worked on 3 outlaw motorcycle gang cases. And one of them in particular you had spoken with me, sent me notes on earlier, is kind of what you describe as one of your proudest moments.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that was a gang case. It was actually a very big case. A lot of information, a lot of data, and that was an outlaw motorcycle gang case that started out targeting the Vagos outlaw motorcycle gang. Myself and Jeff Wodarski, Boise police detective, he and I were co-case agents on it. We worked a lot with the other Boise PD gang detectives, and narcotics detectives would assist us at times. But we quickly found that there was a street gang that was essentially supporting the Vagos, and they didn't ride motorcycles, but they mirrored the rules and regulations that outlaw motorcycle gangs have. They had a set of bylaws and rules that they lived by, so Jeff Wodarski, Dave Levitt, myself go down to Reno to cover the Reno street vibrations because we're following a particular group of Vagos, and we're doing not deep cover but undercover in the bars with the Vagos, and we're there when a group of Hell's Angels. We're literally in the middle of this shootout, but the Hell's Angels, there was about 8 of them that decide to walk right through the casino floor of where the Vagos had set up shop, and there's like 400 Vagos. A beer bottle across the head, a punch in the face, guns come out, knives come out, people are getting shot, and we're within 25 feet, 30 feet of all of this occurring. And knowing that we now have 2 warring factions, Vagos, Hell's Angels, and then a third faction that don't know who we are, that being the police, are quickly arriving. That is not a place to start pulling guns and saying, police, get down, especially in jeans and t-shirts, so we were just, we did what we needed to do to be witnesses. We were involved to the extent that everybody else is running away. We're moving towards it so we can see. But the reason why I give that background is that night, the street gang that was supporting the Vagos, the president of that gang gives an edict and orders his minions to go to the Vago president's house here in Boise, because the Vago president had a wife, and set up security. And they're sitting on security, armed with AK-47s, outside of the Vago's president's house. It wasn't 2 days after that occurrence that Jeff Wodarski gets a phone call. Jeff calls me, and the two of us go meet with an individual who was a member of that street gang, who was sitting outside that Vago's clubhouse with an AK-47 between his feet, wondering what the fuck he had done to get himself into this position. From that point, he became our informant. And he wore audio and video recording devices inside their clubhouse. He was there for meetings. He obtained information pertaining to extortions, home invasions, drug dealing, grand thefts of all different kinds. They were basically, the home invasions that they were doing is that they were robbing drug dealers of their drugs. So they do a home invasion at gunpoint, steal the drugs, and then sell them for themselves. And so that was kind of in a nutshell. Any kind of essentially violent crime that they could be doing, they were essentially doing. And he was getting us evidence. Every single time he wore a wire, we had evidence of some sort. And we were just building the case. It's very hard to not act on one incident, but the problem is if we act on one incident, we only get one suspect. We're trying to eradicate the gang. And so we're able to do that. And we ultimately arrest 14 gang members. A couple go federal for prosecution. The rest go state. But everything from gang recruitment to extortion to we didn't get them on any of the home invasions just because we had past history of them doing it, but we couldn't actually get them involved in what we call a dry conspiracy, meaning they plan to do an actual home invasion, but we intercept them before it's ever able to occur. So we weren't able to set that up. But the kid, I call him a kid, but today, right now, he's probably, this is 2012 when this occurred. He's probably somewhere in his 30s at this point. I had to move him because he was in danger for his life. I moved him. He gets a college degree. He gets married. He now has a kid. He enlists in the military, sends me videos of, he still calls me today, sends me videos of him flying around on a Black Hawk helicopter. He, a couple times a year, he calls me to thank me for saving his life. And invite me to his dad's hunting cabin. He's like, come up hunting with us. And I'll tell you, of any of the criminal investigations that I've ever done, and we've been pretty successful. I mean, we've been pretty successful on most of the criminal investigations we've done. Nothing gives me as much satisfaction as that kid. The fact that I was able to help him out of a situation that he thought was dire, that he had nowhere to turn. The fact that he was able to do that and now be in a place that he's at now, nothing, and probably nothing ever will top that for me as an adult. So,
good story. Let's take a little switch topics a little bit.
Yep.
As an ATF agent, and I don't want to get super political here, but as an ATF agent, I think it's fair to say that the general public or a portion of the public sees ATF as a agency to take away your Second Amendment rights.
Yeah.
How do you see that? And how did other people that you were working with take that perception from the public?
So, in short, I would say that's a misnomer. I would agree that from a inside the Beltway, Washington, D.C. perspective, at least now where we're currently sitting with the current administration, I would agree that that probably absolutely is a goal of theirs. I would say outside the Beltway, from a field agent perspective, 95% or better of all ATF agents are Second Amendment advocates. That a ton of them are competitive shooters. A lot of them that I know are hunters. A lot of them that I know in retirement now teach concealed weapons permit classes, and to citizens. I mean, that they're an advocate for citizens to possess firearms. Obviously, in any case, we go all the way back to the beginning, talking about responsibility. Well, that's a big responsibility. And that's actually part of the concealed weapons classes that are taught. I taught a few as well. I've since let my certification go because I'm doing other things. But one of the things that we talk about is the responsibility of carrying a gun. If you're carrying concealed and you are a law-abiding citizen and something bad happens and you need to react, you should react. But you should also understand that even a police officer, the shooting isn't the biggest portion of what's going to occur. They're going to live through, one, having shot somebody, possibly killed somebody. That's a real mental thing that everybody will have to deal with, a police officer or a citizen. The fact that you've taken a life. And then two, the legal ramifications of that. Are you going to get sued? Highly possible. Actually probable. And so I think that the vast majority of all ATF agents were in the same boat that I was. We were simply looking to proactively and reactively fight violent crime. Shitheads. That's what we're looking at. I took special care anytime I had to deal with an FFL or a firearms dealer or a normal citizen to hopefully erase that stigma, at least as it pertains to ATF in Boise, Idaho. And to this day, I've been retired now since April of 2021. And to this day, I will have either agents or inspectors. There's a difference. Inspectors don't carry a badge. They don't carry a gun. To this day, those guys will tell me, hey, I ran into so-and-so today and they asked me if I knew Ron Shackle. And we're not talking about cops. We're talking about citizens, because I've involved myself in the shooting community, mostly all civilians. I've involved myself with, and they knew what I did and what I stood for. So I did the best I could as an individual to erase that stigma. The fact is that what people see and the people that subscribe to that stigma is they're seeing the news. They're seeing what Washington is putting out, what inside the Beltway, what their talking points are, what their narrative is. And they're seeing that from the perspective of watching Fox News, which I'm a diehard watcher of Fox News, but they see that. And now they think that that's what ATF does. In reality, that's what like 2% of ATF does. The rest of us are out there fighting violent crime.
Let's talk a little bit about the Beltway and kind of what's going on right now without getting too political. To your exact point of what you're talking about. So the recent stories that I hear about are oh, ATF is now taking away specific FFL licenses, or we talk about pistol braces, and a lot of these are executive orders that the president is taking out. What's your take on that as a former ATF agent in terms of the politicalization of ATF because of what's going on with the FBI and the IRS, and in some cases with the your old agency?
Well, so I look at it with an eye on kind of two perspectives. One is whenever they try and ban or outlaw or restrict a certain thing, pistol braces is what you mentioned, right? Does that pistol brace, I'm a very analytical person, so I look at things and I go, what does that pistol brace do? Does it make the weapon more dangerous? No, it doesn't. I mean, it still puts a round down range, and the only thing it does is people utilize a pistol brace in a manner that the pistol brace wasn't necessarily designed for, and that is shouldering it. So they shoulder a pistol brace instead of using a pistol brace as a pistol, right? And so, again, I look at that from an analytical standpoint. Okay, does it make the weapon any more dangerous? Not really. It might make you slightly more accurate. If you shoulder a weapon and you use two hands to fire it, you're more accurate than if you fire with one hand, right? But is the weapon really any more dangerous? No, it's not. Flash suppressors, on the old assault weapons ban that came in under Clinton, flash suppressors, bayonet lugs. Who do you know has ever fixed bayonets? I mean, really, it's you have politicians who know zero about guns making laws that make zero sense. And so I look at it from that perspective. But then I also look at it from the perspective of that political thing, where it's very difficult to put an analytical spin to it because there is no legitimate analysis of what they're trying to do, except for the fact that it fits a political narrative. It fits their ideology. The ideology of one side of the fence versus the other side of the fence are they're polar opposite. The conservative or libertarian would say, hey, the Constitution says this. This is what should be. And the liberal side of that fence thinks of it as a living document, right? And so, I heard Biden talk about, what was it? He goes, back when these laws were written, an individual couldn't own a cannon. No, you could. Yeah, you could. Yeah, during the revolution, yeah, absolutely could. But it shouldn't surprise me because, I mean, he's dense on most topics and lies about the other ones. So it is what it is.
Glad we didn't get too political there.
Yeah.
Okay, I always like to end up asking a few questions in terms of how law enforcement affected you personally. So being a law enforcement officer, going back to, a police officer all the way up until your ATF days, how did it affect your family?
I would say, in one word, negative. It was a negative effect, or a net negative, for the first, 16, 18 years of a almost 25-year career, it was my identity. It's what I was. It's what I did. It's every single friend I had was a law enforcement officer. that's not necessarily the case anymore. I still have a lot of friends who are cops or agents, but that's not the case anymore. And I would say that my ex-wife, and these are from her lips, so it's not me misunderstanding her. This is what she said prior to our divorce. She says, "I always thought that you had a stressful job, and when you wanted to go and do shooting competitions or go hunting or do those things, generally with the guys, I was always very supportive." And to an extent, she was right. However, and it took me a while to understand it, because I didn't necessarily know in the moment, but really what I wanted was a partner. And because of, in part, not only, but in part of, because of the job, I did a lot of things that were very not partner-like. I spent hours, out with the guys working. When I said before I worked with the narcs, Bandit, I mean, the shift was 1 to 11. It was 1 to 11 Monday through Thursday or Tuesday through Friday. I'm trying to remember which. But very seldom were we off at 11. I mean, I'd roll in at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning because we were out buying drugs, following shitheads around. And then I'd sleep in and she'd go to work and we'd see each other in passing a lot of times. And it just didn't make for a good partnership. It took me a while. After the divorce, actually attended on my own, just by myself, counseling and I was never a counselor type guy, but attended counseling for 4 years. And it took me a long time to understand exactly what it was of not only kind of who I was, but what I desired in life. And then and I now know it's a partner, somebody that gets me, that I get, that we do things together. And I'm lucky now. I mean, I have a fiance who came out of law enforcement. Actually met her. She was a detective, no longer in law enforcement. And we have that partnership. It's interesting. It's an interesting dilemma, because a job that I enjoyed so much, at the end, I wanted to be done with so bad. Every day I wake up now in retirement, even though I'm kind of pseudo still working, doing the contract stuff. Every day I wake up and I go, oh, thank God I don't have to go there. Every day. So, I would say the job in part caused that separation. The partnership really kind of fell apart. We ended up going down 2 different paths in life. She was headed down her path, and it was her interests, and I was headed down my path, and it was my interests, and we made attempts to try and figure out how to diverge those things, or converge, not diverge, converge those paths back into one. And I might have already been done. I mean, unfortunately, because I never want to see somebody, including myself, I was 24 years that we were married, never want to see a marriage go down the tubes, especially one in which we were such good friends as well, but really could never get on the same page on some other stuff. And then, of course, there's the, which is fairly typical of law enforcement officers, I start making bad decisions. And there's infidelity kind of fell into that. And but my character, what character I had left after I started making bad decisions, is every time I would do that, it left a pit, a hole in my stomach, and I went kind of in a dark place emotionally, and I ultimately, I couldn't keep the secret, so I had a telling on myself, and just said I can't do this anymore, and from that time on, I was pretty open about everything, right, wrong, or indifferent, whether it hurt somebody's feelings or not. I was pretty open, and still am with my current fiance.
You alluded to this earlier, Ron, but you said you had an estrangement from your daughter, and I'm assuming that's a result of the job. And ultimately, what happened, and did you repair that?
So I will say this: is that I raised Carrie as my own, and cared for her and supported her, but in a lot of respects, where you would see a father attend a soccer game or in her case, a volleyball game. In a lot of cases, I was working. I was somewhere else. I wasn't attending some of that stuff. I got to go to some choir concerts and that kind of thing, on occasion. But I was always, when I was home, I was always there. I didn't retreat into into my own bubble, my own shell when I was home. When I was there, I was there, and she was included, and she was the only child, and she was included in a lot of stuff. I mean, she grew up around probably more adults than she did kids, because we would have friends over for barbecues, and she was always there. She was part of that, and for a long time, I was Superman. I wore a cape to her. When she went to Eagle High School, I would go and teach government classes. One of the teachers there would have me come in and teach 2-hour block of government class, and I'd go in and I'd do that, and she would, not very typical of teenagers, where their parents show up and they're like, well, I don't know that person, right? She would get out of the class that she was supposed to be in just so that she could come in and sit in the class that I was teaching. I would walk into school and she would get on my back and I would carry her in like a piggyback down the hall of their high school. And this is as a junior, senior at Eagle High. And so the separation during events, I think, was part of it, but then that distance between her mother and I that was being created, and then of course my decisions to step out and be unfaithful caused her to basically choose corners. I think that even though I'm not proud of what I did, and I know that Tricia and I have had conversations after the fact, and we both kind of understand to some extent why the partnership wasn't a partnership. We ended up kind of walking our own separate paths during a 24-year relationship. We kind of understood maybe why the bad decisions were being made, but they were still bad decisions. I mean, I still made bad decisions, and she has not been able to see. She's not been able to see fit to forgive me for that. Now, I still have some contact with her. And for a lot of years after the divorce, I kind of groveled a little bit, trying to win back the love that I once had. And I just have realized that if and when that comes, it's going to be on her terms. And so I let her have her space. I'm actually attending a football game for my grandson tonight. And she'll sit in front of me. We'll have conversation, but it'll all be very surface. There won't be anything that is covered that really should be covered to mend that relationship. Not because I don't want to, it's because she doesn't want to. So
We talked a little bit about your daughter's estrangement and your divorce, but there was also a discussion about not being there for your parents when they passed away.
Yeah.
Was there a moment in time, Ron? Was there something that happened that you went, crap, I gotta stop? And what was that?
Yeah, there was kind of two moments in time. One was at the death of my father in 2006. That was more of a mental and physical well-being nut check, so to speak. That was, hey, you need to do better at taking care of yourself. My dad was 68 when he passed away. My grandfather, his dad, 68 when he passed away from the same thing. And so I, of course, in my head, I'm going, all right, well, I'm going to start taking care of myself better. So I did do that. And then I would say that during the course of my mom passed and she suffered dementia. So it was really a long period of time before she passed. She passed in January 2019, but we kind of lost her a year and a half to 2 years prior to that, when she had to be hospitalized in memory care, and I was going through some very difficult times with my wife at the time, trying to find a common path for us to walk down. And then when Mom passed, I realized that if I wasn't happy, I needed to kind of be okay with moving on. And it really wasn't until 2019 where I kind of really wrapped my brain around the fact that, and at that point in 2019, my fiance and I were dating at that time. And she knew. I mean, I was very open with her about everything, to include what I wanted out of life and out of a relationship. And then when Mom passed is kind of when I finally fully gave myself emotionally to that relationship, because I was still harboring, I had an ex-wife who I felt a lot of guilt for the loss of that relationship. Guilt in the loss, not loss, but definitely a strained relationship with my daughter. And that after Mom passed, and one of the last things she was ever able to say was that I just want to go be with your dad. And that need and want to be with someone, is all I've ever really strived for. And I have that now. And I wish it could have. It's weird to say, because I'm happy in one respect now, and I'm happy that things happen for a reason. I'm happy where I'm at, but failure after essentially, a quarter century roughly, is something that still doesn't sit well with me. I feel like I failed. And at the same time, I really wouldn't want it any different right now. It's a weird dilemma. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last question, Ron. I always like to ask, if you can go back, think of when you started with the police department up until the time that you retired, or maybe even till now. Do you think your views on people changed?
Oh, yeah. I mean, hell yeah. You become very. What I'll say is that you become very cynical on the job. Everybody, and I'm not talking about just with criminals and normal people. I'm talking about with bosses, people in the job. I've come across some very toxic leaders. If you want to call them leaders, they've been placed in positions of leadership. And you become very cynical of their motivations. And much in the same way that you would a criminal. You know, a criminal has a motivation, right? To whatever that is, score their next fix, steal that car, whatever their motivation is, it's all here. It's all about them. And I have run across leaders that, and I know it's true of all agencies, that have that exact mentality. It just isn't, well, no, I guess some people, and there was a leader that was breaking the law, but it's just not generally breaking the law, but it's still about them. It's still about their need to promote, their need to take that next step on the ladder. Doesn't matter if it's stepping on your back or not. So their motivations, you know, you just become very cynical. Now, I will say this, is that being retired since April 2021, it took a little while. And it took me being friends with non-law enforcement people to start kind of gaining back my love of humanity, so to speak, I guess. I've got a friend of mine that, I won't mention his name, but he's a businessman now. And he grew up in Fresno, grew up in gangland. Guy's been stabbed and shot. He's pointed guns at people. I mean, he at one time in his life, I would have arrested. However, today he lives here and he's a businessman. And I can tell you, I don't know an individual smarter than this guy. He is, without a doubt, one of the most impressive people I think I've ever met. He was a welder by trade, but the guy can put together a rod or a race car from a pile of bolts. He is involved in and became a world-class F-class rifle shooter. I don't know if anybody in the audience knows what F-class is, but basically it's shooting really tiny small holes at 1,000 yards. And he was world-class and holds some world records. And now he builds rifle stocks with CNC machine and builds, I mean, we're talking $3,000 a piece. They're works of art, and everything he does, he just is able to figure it out. You know, you might have somebody that goes, how do I change that light bulb? You know, this guy knows how to take the light bulb apart, redesign it, and then put it back. I mean, he's just amazing, the kind of knowledge he has. But I gained that respect from him, or for him, during the course of my my separation from my wife, my divorce from my wife, and now with my fiance, and we met over a beer. I didn't even know the guy. He was sitting next to me at the bar. Now I know him, and like I said, years ago, I would have arrested him. Today, he's one of the most impressive people I know. So you do get some of that humanity back, or that trust in humanity back. But there's always a little cynicism back there. You're always, what's your angle type of thing. And that is it's part of the job. I mean, just you're wired to think that way, you know, because if you don't, you're not recognizing the suspicious activity. You're not recognizing the crimes that are being committed. So you're kind of forced into being very cynical. And then some people can never come out of it. Some people will be cynical for the rest of their lives. You know?
Yeah. Ron, thank you for the interview.
Yeah, brother. It's good doing it.
Appreciate it.
All right, man.